or the copy as much as it does the original. And this is the pleasure that we get when we read a play, when we watch a play. That brings me to another point, the tragi-comedy. There have been critics down the ages who have criticized even great dramatists like Shakespeare for introducing comedy in his tragedies. One of the scenes that comes to my mind immediately, probably, is the gravedigger scene in Hamlet, which some of you might remember. Ophelia is dead. Laertes walks in with her body. Hamlet is grieving. And then you have the gravediggers talking about the skulls. Should Shakespeare have introduced it? Many critics believe that it takes away from the tragic mood. Many critics believe that it heightens the tragic mood. Dr. Johnson himself is very clear on this point. He says, since in life, tragedy and comedy, pain and pleasure, joy and sorrow come together, it should come together also in a play. It must appeal to us only because it is natural, only because it seems real, and therefore you should not have a play which is full of sorrow or a play which is full of joy and happiness. So no full tragedies or full comedies. He says we must have tragedy and comedy being combined together, because this is what, according to him, approaches life. The next point that we have to look at when we think of him as a critic is practical criticism. How does he do that? He applies his judgment to his authors, to the contemporaries or to earlier authors. This is what he does. And he finds that you cannot have rules by themselves. All rules should be tested by application. And this is what he does. For a very, very quick recapitulation, we have been talking about the chief characteristics, right? All the characteristics of Johnson as a critic. But when you look at Johnson, I also want you to remember Johnson as a man. And therefore, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the life of Dr. Johnson. And then, of course, I shall go on and read to you some passages from Johnson's great works of criticism. Life of Dr. Johnson by James Boswell, who was born in 1740 and died in 1795. You would remember that Dr. Johnson was born in 1709 and died in 1784. Who was Boswell? Who was Boswell? Boswell was a writer, was a small writer. He went on a tour to a place called Corsica, and then he wrote an account of his travel. It was quite popular, and so immediately he got the epithet Corsica Boswell. He then took a tour of the Hebrides with Dr. Johnson in 1773, and both of them published separate accounts. He wrote 70 essays for the London magazine. You might ask me why this is important. Because a lot of what we know about Dr. Johnson comes through to us by this wonderful biography called Life of Dr. Johnson. The first edition was published in 1791, the second in 1793, and the third in 1799. So can you imagine, within a span of 8 years, you already had 3 editions. Here's something interesting about Boswell, that his surname has passed into the English language as a term. Boswell, Boswellian, Boswellism. For anyone who is a constant companion and observer, especially one who records those observations in print. Because this is what Boswell did. James Boswell, he just stuck on to Dr. Johnson everywhere. Went with him, sat with him, walked with him, traveled with him, and then wrote the life of Dr. Johnson. But you know, my dear students, it's interesting to see that this biography is not the biography of one individual. In a true sense, it is a biography of the literature and the literary men of Great Britain of that period. Dr. Johnson, of course, is the hero. Dr. Johnson, of course, is the central character. And if you want to use a word we use in novels, he's the protagonist. And of course, in any biography, he would be the main character about whom the biography is being written. But when you see him in the company of Goldsmith, when you see him in the company of Burke, when you see him in the company of Joshua Reynolds, you see not only Dr. Johnson, but you see also these great people. And it must be said, to Boswell's credit, that he is able to project all these writers in very, very realistic terms. Of course, Johnson comes out as the hero. All of them are certainly lesser figures. But remember, after all, he hero worshipped Dr. Johnson. And therefore, he wrote this Life of Dr. Johnson. Who does he compare Dr. Johnson to? It's very interesting. He compares him to Ulysses. Have you heard of Ulysses? Of the great epics, the Greek and Roman epics, the Iliad and the Aeneid? You remember the travels of Ulysses? You remember the adventures that he had? And he says that Dr. Johnson had the ability to travel in time as Ulysses had traveled in space. That is the type of honor, credit, hero worship that we see in Boswell's writing of his biography of Dr. Johnson. Next slide, please. To what extent has Boswell become popular? You must have heard of Sherlock Holmes. You must have heard of his fantastic detective ability. Sherlock Holmes had his constant companion, Dr. Watson, and he calls him my Boswell. That is the kind of companion, constant companion who lives with you all the time. So that's about the great biography of Dr. Johnson, which gives us a clear picture of Johnson as a person, as a writer, and as a great individual. Let us now spend some time talking about two important works from which we get our ideas, from which we draw our conclusions about Dr. Johnson as a critic. The first one that I would like to talk about is Lives of Poets. Dr. Johnson himself called it Little Lives and Little Prefaces to a Little Edition of the English Poets. I've just listed some of the poets. What is interesting is Dr. Johnson did not set out to write this book. Some publisher who was planning to bring out an anthology of British poetry approached Dr. Johnson and asked him whether he would write a little introduction to each of these poets. My dear students, I'm sure you've seen many anthologies. Some of them have been prescribed to you. So when you open a book and there is one poem on his blindness by John Milton, for example, you have about 8 or 10 lines about Milton and then something about the poem, maybe. You open another page, you've got The Solitary Reaper by William Wordsworth. You've got something about Wordsworth. Now, this is what the publisher wanted Dr. Johnson to do. And what did Dr. Johnson do? He wrote so much that finally this book, all that he wrote, the collection, did not become a part of the anthology at all, but was instead published as Lives of Poets. Can you imagine somebody asking you to write 10 lines and you writing maybe 1,000 lines about that author, about that poet? Who were these poets? Today, when we look at them about 200 years later, many of these poets are not important to us at all. But remember, we are talking about the 18th century where a particular publisher wanted to bring out. So if you apply Dr. Johnson's test, you would find they could not please long. That is, with a span of 200 years, these poets are no more considered great poets. But in Johnson's own time, they were considered great poets, and that is why this particular publisher wanted to bring out a collection of the important poems written by these poets. I could go on and on about what he wrote about each of these poets, but I want to draw your attention to just one or two because they show us Johnson as a critic in the real sense of the term. Some of you might have, in your second year or first year or probably in your third year of BA, come across a group of poets to whom we refer as the metaphysical poets. The metaphysical poets, and usually we have the name of John Donne. Why were they called metaphysical poets? Isn't it strange that it is Dr. Johnson who gave them this name? Very interesting, because he was actually writing a biographical note, remember, for that anthology, on Cowley. Today we don't talk about Cowley as much as we talk about Donne. But at that stage, Cowley was considered an important poet. And therefore, Dr. Johnson writes, Cowley, like other poets who have written with narrow views, and instead of tracing intellectual pleasure to its natural sources, in the mind of man, paid their court to temporary prejudices, etc., etc. And he goes on. About the beginning of the 17th century, he writes, appeared a race of writers that may be termed the metaphysical poets. So Dr. Johnson calls them the metaphysical poets, of whom, in a criticism on the works of Cowley, it is not improper to give some account. My dear students, the double negative so beautifully used, not improper, what does it become? It becomes proper. And therefore, he defines and describes the group that we talk today as metaphysical poets. The metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. But unluckily, resolving to show it in rhyme, instead of writing poetry, they only wrote verses. And very often such verses as stood the trial of the finger better than of the ear, for the modulation was so imperfect that they were only found to be verses by counting the syllables. I think it's terrible criticism for a group of poets who we still consider to be very important. Milton and Dryden are there, Congreve is there, Gray is there, Swift is there. These are names you know, my dear students. But there are also names like Edmund Smith, almost unknown to us today, most of us students and teachers of English literature. You've got Littleton, you've got Gay, maybe you've heard of him. Dr. Johnson is such a great critic that I realize we really have to rush through, because I want to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about his preface to Shakespeare. In this preface, a beautifully written work, he talks about the importance of comparison as a tool. In order to understand the importance, the greatness of one writer, you must be able to compare him to other writers, maybe of the same period. He then talks about why we consider Shakespeare to be such a great writer. What are the reasons for his continued popularity to this day? And he says, he was a poet of nature. Shakespeare, he says, is above all writers, at least above all modern writers, the poet of nature. The poet that holds up to his readers a faithful mirror of manners and of life. His characters are not modified by the customs of particular places, unpracticed by the rest of the world, by the peculiarities of studies, etc. His persons act and speak by the influence of those general passions and principles by which all minds are agitated, and the whole system of life is continued in motion. What are the other qualities that make Shakespeare a great writer? According to Dr. Johnson, his ability at characterization. Real, natural characters as they existed in the days of Shakespeare. And his ability to write tragi-comedy. Remember, we've already talked about the importance of tragi-comedy. How does he conclude that Shakespeare is a great writer? How does he conclude? He gives us various reasons, and then he says, and it's beautiful, the simile that he uses. The work of a correct and regular writer is a garden, accurately formed and diligently planted, varied with shades and scented with flowers. The composition of Shakespeare is a forest, in which oaks extend their branches and pines tower in the air, interspersed sometimes with weeds and brambles, and sometimes giving shelter to myrtles and to roses, filling the eye with awful pomp and gratifying the mind with endless diversity. Other poets display cabinets of precious rarities, minutely finished, wrought into shape, and polished into brightness. Shakespeare opens a mine which contains gold and diamonds in inexhaustible plenty, though clouded by incrustations, debased by impurities, and mingled with a mass of meaner minerals. And remember, the mines, the deeper you go, the better you get. It has been much disputed, he says, whether Shakespeare owed his excellence to his own native force or whether he had the common helps of scholastic education and the examples of ancient authors. If you have the time, you must look at a book like this, which has a collection of some fantastic critical writing down the ages. It would help to sometimes read the writer themselves than to read only about the writer. My dear students, do read the writers themselves, because then you will be able to appreciate the real greatness of the writer. Let us now try and conclude about Dr. Johnson as a critic. Dr. Johnson, a multifaceted personality. What did he do? What did he achieve? What is his contribution to English literary criticism? Of the 18th century, we can certainly say that Dr. Johnson was the last great critic of the age. We can also say that he delivered genius from bondage, because he clearly believed, and I repeat, I stress on the word clearly believed, that rules should not become prescriptive. Rules should not bind us. Rules should help genius to flower and to grow. He also told us that time is the best critic. Allow a writer 100 years before deciding whether he was a great writer or not. He passed the sentence that only time can pass the final sentence. I'm just suggesting to you that we have to move from Dr. Johnson into the Romantic age, and therefore you notice that we've got something from Keats. Johnson paved the way in many ways to the Romantic age by telling us that rules are necessary, but rules are not always compulsory. Remember that we then are going